Now, 2 years ago, David Cameron declared that he was against the idea of a second runway at Stansted Airport. Within weeks of him becoming Prime Minister, the plans were dropped. Now, this week, a fringe meeting will be held here entitled, "Are the Conservatives Now Anti-Flying?" Andrew Sinclair has this report.
Over the last 20 years, Stansted Airport has grown phenomenally, fuelled by the growth in low-cost air travel. It's become the third busiest airport in the UK. A second runway was supposed to be open by 2017, but then this happened.
We've never supported plans for a second runway at Stansted.
So there would be no second runway at Stansted under a Conservative government?
As we said, that has never been part of our plans.
At that moment, Stansted's second runway began to become unlikely, and once Mr Cameron entered Downing Street, the plans were put on hold. Environmental groups have wondered if they're still being quietly worked on. No, they're not, said the airport, which this weekend revealed that it's planning to sell off the blighted homes it bought up.
Well, the economic case for a second runway hasn't changed. What has changed significantly is the political environment. We can never say never about runway development, but what we would stress is that government policy today, and it's very clear policy, is all about making what we have better. So that's what we're focusing our efforts on. Second runways are not likely to happen here for some years, and government policy is very clearly stating that that isn't going to happen. So we totally support government policy.
The business and aviation communities are confused by the Conservatives. A third runway at Heathrow was also stopped, while an increase in air passenger duty was given the go-ahead. From next month, passengers will pay £12 per person for short-haul flights, £60 for flights to the east coast of America, and £85 on long-haul flights to places like Australia. The tax has gone up by 325% in the last 4 years.
Well, the Conservative government's policy of not allowing new infrastructure in terms of new runways and pushing ahead with quite eye-watering rises in the tax on flying from the 1st of November, if that's not an anti-flying policy, it's certainly a policy which will disadvantage the UK in competitive terms, but socially it will certainly push us back to a time where ordinary people began to feel that flying was beyond their reach financially and push it back to the preserve of a wealthy elite.
In recent years, the Conservative Party has become more green, opposing airport expansion, promoting public transport.
We recognise in the 21st century transport has to take account of climate change and we need to move to low carbon systems of transport. That means for shorter journeys using efficient cars, it means using railways, not aeroplanes. And so it's an understanding of the way the world is changing in the first half of the 21st century.
Stansted says it can live with that.
Government is paying an enormous amount of attention now to aviation as an industry on the existing infrastructure, and there's been a number of meetings coordinated by government ministers to look at making the three key strategic London airports, Heathrow, Gatwick and Stansted, better, not bigger. And at the moment we're very impressed with how far that's gone.
But others in the industry believe it's only a matter of time before the Conservatives are forced to become more aviation friendly.
If we don't provide infrastructure, then we will pay a big price for that in terms of lost jobs and lost investment, and we are going to have to address that as a nation.
Douglas Carswell, you, the Conservatives, are supposed to be the party for business, so why aren't you aviation friendly?
Well, I'm a big fan of cheap air travel. It's one of the miracles of the modern age. I'm not a big fan of big corporate vested interests and their lobbyists trying to dictate public policy. I think we need to look seriously long term at Boris Johnson's idea of perhaps an entirely new airport for the southeast.
Nadine Dorries, you have Luton Airport on your doorstep of your constituency, so how important is the airport to the local economy, for instance?
Oh, it's incredibly important. Many of the airport employees live in my constituency. Luton is ideally placed in terms of geographically, close to a motorway, close to London. That is an airport which would benefit from expansion, and the local economy would also benefit from expansion. So I would love to see Luton expanded, and the staff at the airport would love to see a new runway at Luton. So I'm not totally bought into the idea that we completely clamp down on the expansion of airports. I think Boris is absolutely right. I don't even think we need to look for a new airport. We can look at Luton. Luton is ideally placed to be that new hub for London.
What about, Douglas Carswell, this matter of rented properties across Essex near Stansted? Will that be resolved, do you think?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think it's something we need to look at and follow, but let's wait and see.
Are you sending mixed messages as a party to business and aviation? Because a third runway at Heathrow has been stopped whilst this issue of air passenger duty that has increased so much.
At Heathrow, one can understand. It was geographically, it was not Heathrow is not in the right position. It is in a very dense residential area. It is completely built up. There are issues to do with safety at Heathrow. So Heathrow was not the right airport to be extended.
Right.
There are many other airports that can. So it's not mixed messages. The message is Heathrow wasn't right. It wasn't the right airport to have a third runway. But from my perspective, the message should be there are other airports such as Luton, which would be ideal for expansion.
All right, let's move on. Douglas Carswell, you've outlined a number of ideas that have supported the policies of the coalition government, things like directly elected police chiefs, open primaries to choose MPs, and the right to recall or remove them. Wouldn't open primaries really reduce the role of party members if everyone can participate in selecting who their MP candidate should be? Doesn't that
Actually, experience is the opposite. If you allow everyone to have a say in choosing the Conservative Party candidate, and the same would go for Labour and Liberal Democrats, experience shows that actually you increase local membership by including everyone in the process. It's a paradox. But we've got to accept the fundamental failing of our political system is that 7 out of 10 politicians in Westminster come from safe seats, from one-party fiefdoms. We need to do something to address that, and open primaries is one way of doing it. There are other ways of doing it, recall, electoral reform, but we do need to make sure that anyone who sits in the House of Commons only gets there through competitive election contests on a regular basis. That doesn't happen at the moment. It's a bit like rotten boroughs in the 19th century. We need to change it.
Nadine Dorries, let's talk about this principle of alternative voting, so-called AV, where voters basically rank the candidates in order of preference. There's a referendum in May. Are you in favour?
Absolutely not. And if anything, the Labour leadership competition last week shows why we shouldn't support AV. David Miliband secured the highest number of votes, but Ed Miliband actually became leader because that's how it works with AV. There are second preferences and there are transference of preferences. AV is not a good system. Look at Australia. The Labour, Julie Gillard, has walked into the government with the least number of votes, but on AV she becomes the leader.
Douglas Carswell, do you agree with Nadine Dorries?
I do agree with Nadine. I want to change the political system, but AV is the one change we don't need. AV would actually insulate politicians from the views of voters. It's the system that we don't need. There are other systems that we could look at, and I've teamed up with Caroline Lucas, the first Green MP in Westminster, to propose some amendments to the bill next week as it comes before Parliament.
So Nadine Dorries, do you believe that these reforms are a price worth paying for to be in the coalition?
I think it's a price yes, we have to have the referendum because that was part of the package. But I believe quite sincerely that the country will say no. I think the arguments against AV, there are only 2 other countries that have this form of voting apart from us. That's Fiji and Papua New Guinea. And Fiji are about to drop it because it doesn't work. I think the electorate will see that and vote against it.
Douglas Carswell, thank you both very much indeed.